Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I want to hopefully finish off my review of Caleb Jackson's video on the resurrection, the case against the resurrection. So Caleb, as a Christian, is putting on his atheist cap and making, according to him, the best case that an atheist can make against the truth of Jesus' resurrection. And I've done two parts already. Those were quite a bit long. So again, I want to finish this off in this part here for everyone. So I'm going to try to be a little bit more concise and less repetitive. And let's just get straight into it. And I'll play it and give my quick advice as we go. So let's, with that said, let's get straight into the appearances as described in the Gospels now.
Here. All right. What do we do with the gospel appearances where Jesus is allegedly appearing to groups of people and eating and talking, and it seems very contrary to what Paul has in mind? Well, we have to. What's interesting to note is that the Gospels, at least in this regard, and other places, seem to chronologically get more and more embellished and more elaborate as time goes on, right? And so this is important because apologists will want to say that the Gospels are very reliable, and so if they tell us they saw this and they were sincere, then we should believe that they saw this, right? That we can trust them because they get other details right. This allows us, with epistemic routing, to be justified in the other details they get right. So, but that works the other way around. If we have good reasons from our background knowledge to think the Gospels have a habit of either exaggerating or inventing the details and elaborating all this stuff, that hurts our confidence that when they tell us really extraordinary details like a dead man talking to them, that we should believe them. We should be even more skeptical. So, in other examples of this, in Mark, Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist, but as the Gospels get later with Matthew, Luke, and John, we see John goes out of his way to say, no, Jesus, you should be the one baptizing me. I'm not worthy. And a lot of scholars think this is because there were competing sects between John and Jesus as far as who was the Messiah. And so the Christians wanted to make sure that John's followers knew that John was submitting to Jesus and that Jesus would never be baptized because he was inferior to John. We see this as well with Jesus having a messianic secret in Mark, tell no one, don't let them know I'm the Messiah, being very subtle. To John, he just flat out says, yep, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of God, very explicit with it, to the point where the Pharisees went to stone him, and it's a very big shift of tone. In the Gospels, we have Pilate gets more and more innocent, so in Mark, he seems like, okay, yeah, what did Jesus do, and doesn't have that many qualms about punishing him, whereas by the time I get to, Matthew, his wife's like, no, Pilate, I had a dream, and this man's innocent, please don't kill him. And Luke, he's like, well, no, I want to have Herod to make sure this man's innocent first. And the Jews really had to twist his arm to get him to do this. And then John, he hands Jesus over to the Pharisees and says, you can crucify him. He hands them over to them. And so Pilate gets more and more absolved from this. And of course, in Matthew, he literally washes his hands and says, I'm not guilty of this man. And so the Christians are shifting the blame from the Romans to the Jews as time goes on in this anti-Semitic kind of trend. And another example is that the burial of Jesus becomes more honorable over time. In Mark, he's buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. He's wrapped up, that's about it. Whereas Matthew, Luke, and John, in Matthew, it's his own family tomb, and it's by himself, and it's a very nice, rich person's tomb. And Luke and John, he's buried by Nicodemus, and they get perfumes, they get spices, and it's a very expensive and very royal burial for a condemned criminal. And so we see this elaboration as well. So if the Gospels are willing to do this with other details, for apologetic reasons, why not be so much more suspicious when the details in the Gospels on the resurrection also seem to follow a similar trend? For example, again, when Paul gives us the description of the resurrection, it's very vague, doesn't give us detail. It just says, I saw Jesus, and implies these could perhaps be visionary. In Mark, we don't get any narrated appearances. We only get the angels saying, yeah, Jesus will appear to Peter, but we don't know what that's going to look like, what the nature of that was. In Matthew, we do get a very brief appearance to the women on their way back. And he says, go tell the disciples. And the disciples see Jesus on a hill, on a very mountainous region. It's implied that this is like from a distance, a very wide, large area. And the disciples have lots of doubts. It says some doubted, and then it moves on. It doesn't try to resolve the doubts. For all Matthew knows, they could still be doubting to this day. In Luke, we have, angels there, but now the grave clothes are unwrapped. So the body wasn't just stolen, because who would unwrap a body? Same with Matthew, because Matthew also had the guards at the tomb to prevent theft. So we see that the accusation of theft trying to be countered by the guards or the grave clothes being there. And at this time, the appearance of the disciples happens, in an enclosed room, so not from a distance like in Matthew. And it also happens where the doubts are resolved. So in Matthew they doubt, in Luke they doubt, but Jesus says, "Oh, but I can eat and touch me. Now you don't have to doubt. Now they believe." John does a very similar thing with the grave clothes. Again, the grave clothes immediately folded. Jesus appears to them, resolves their doubts. Thomas says, "No, I won't believe." Jesus appears to Thomas. He touches Jesus. He believes. And so we see this theme of explaining away why the body couldn't be stolen, explaining away why the doubts weren't important, explaining away why Jesus wasn't merely a ghost. And we know from people like Celsus that early Christians were being accused of seeing ghosts. And so these seem like apologetic, legendary exaggerations being added on in the later Gospels that we don't see in our earlier sources. So given that we know that the Gospels do this in other places, this is the better hypothesis as far as explaining these as legendary and not authentic. But even if we were to take a lot of these passages as written, or at least as some historical.
Okay, so I'm going to pause that and just go back. Okay, so his first argument, as I can tell here, is basically one that just lumps all the gospels. So again, he's got a different methodology than I do. I think mine's better. Look at establish the individual facts. I can prove there was an appearance to Paul. I can prove there was an appearance to the 12. I can appear and all the details that go with that. It's appeared to the 12, he appeared to them bodily, or he appeared to them, he ate food with them, whatever the facts are, establish that first. Here he's kind of just lumping, again, his method is the Gospels. This is our next chronological source, and he's giving criticism of the source in the form of, look, the Gospels tend to develop over time or add details and stuff like that. Not the first place, there's another side to this. There are criticisms of this and say this is, for example, I've heard Caleb the Atheist and some of his facts kind of exaggerating and getting details wrong and stuff like that. Like he's, for example, he says, oh, in one of the appearances, there was a lot of doubt. The Bible never says that. It just says some doubted and stuff like that. So you got to watch these atheists, including Caleb the Atheist, not falling for you with that cap. But anyways, yeah, you got to just make sure that the atheist isn't exaggerating the case in the first place. There are responses to this, right? Mike Lacona goes into great detail. He's worked in gospel scholarship and gives solid answers addressing and kind of refuting what Caleb the Atheist's interpretation of this is. It's not necessarily a development for the reasons he's specified or even a development at all. There are others, J.P. Holding, Lydia McGrew, these can all be harmonized, and I've seen great explanations on that. I'm not going to fall into that trap just to save time because I don't have time to go into this. And quite frankly, I'm in a bit of a rush today. So the first thing I'm just going to say is, okay, so let's grant all of this for the sake of argument. Who cares? What's Caleb the Atheist's point here? How does this falsify the resurrection hypothesis? And I spoke to Caleb in person the other day, so I can confirm the hypothesis that Caleb the Atheist has in mind is that God raised Jesus bodily from the dead. And as an atheist, he's saying that hypothesis is false. That's his claim. That's it. So in that case, yeah, I'm going to challenge him and say, let's pretend there was this development for the sake of argument. I'll just grant you everything you say. Who cares? That does not falsify the resurrection hypothesis. Well, how are you proving that the fact that they made up details in time proves that the resurrection didn't happen? Caleb just doesn't give us the information at this point. Is he assuming that some of these secondary details are necessary in order to establish the truth of the resurrection hypothesis, that a supernatural miracle took place? Like, does it have to be the case that two angels were at the tomb? Otherwise, the resurrection couldn't have happened. Does it have to be the case that the grave clothes were unwrapped? Otherwise, or that Jesus ate to dissolve doubts? No, none of this is necessary for the resurrection hypothesis to be true. It may be relevant for certain arguments in favor of the resurrection hypothesis or it being a miracle or something like that. But again, I just have no context, right? In this case, if he's thinking of a resurrection hypothesis established on the basis of authenticating factors, like, oh, there is multimodal or multi-sensory data. They ate food with him. It was prolonged. They talked to him. They touched him, ate with him, smelled him, saw him, heard him, stuff like that. I don't know if maybe this would be relevant in that case. Then, if you're going to say, well, these details aren't historical, or we can't prove these details are historical, then you can't use them as an argument proving the resurrection hypothesis is true at an explanatory level, perhaps. But yeah, I just have no clue why this matters specifically for Caleb the atheist. There is no specification of, so what? Well, what's the point of this? Let's pretend it's true. What does that mean? Secondly, so two responses then, again, assuming this. As I said, people adopt minimal facts approach. Caleb the Christian, he adopts what he calls a moderate facts approach. That's the approach I take as well, although mine's different than his. I have different moderate level facts. Not everyone has to adopt a maximal facts approach like Lydia McGrew and stuff, or Jonathan McClatchy. We can say that these facts are false or non-historical and still hold the truth of the resurrection and hold on to a historical core. So remember, in methodology, right? In historiography, this happens all the time. Details get exaggerated or embellished in writings, but historians can still prove that a historical core is true based on the criteria of authenticity. These are secular criteria that all ancient Roman historians will use or recognize, and they work in sussing out and establishing historical kernels or facts within a text, even if there is some embellishment in the secondary details or development in the secondary details that we think are probably false or something. So that's the number one response. That's what you'll get from Gary Habermas. If you adopt a moderate facts approach or a minimal facts approach, you can grant all of this and it doesn't matter. That said, if you are taking the maximal facts approach, don't fall for Caleb's tricks. Just because I'm not giving the answer, Caleb the atheist's tricks here, there are responses to this that can refute that there is this quote unquote habit of exaggerating or development. No, you can prove that these are all facts. Every detail is a fact in terms of the resurrection appearances, according to some. Again, you have to look at those arguments, and there's no discussion in this video of that for me to engage with. Now, the second point I wanted to make is, again, assuming that what Caleb the atheist is saying is true, is that there is this tendency to exaggerate or develop over time. Now let's pretend that's true. Doesn't that actually, that again itself is proof of the reality or historical reliability of the historical core and kernels independently, because this is true life. This is what people do. When you have a historical event like the sinking of the Titanic or any momentous event, 9/11 and stuff like that, you have that proven historical core. An event took place. The resurrection appearances took place. But then over time, people embellished or made up secondary details. And this fits what behavioral science says about people who talk about the truth, right? So if Caleb the atheist wants us to go, well, straight from the beginning, the appearances, you don't even have a minimal fact. The appearances of Jesus, we just have to say they're all totally made up because people later on embellished. That's totally false. No, it actually proves that the earliest stuff is probably historical. The core is historical, even if the later secondary details aren't, because that's what peeps do. And behavioral science proves that if you're lying, if they were lying, if the appearances just had no historical validity at all, it was just made up totally, then what we would see is these made up secondary details right at the beginning of Paul or Mark, because that's what liars do. I mean, you can watch the trial with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, and there's so much analyzing by a guy named Spidey I think in his YouTube channel, Behavioral Arts, is a world's expert in this area, and he's analyzing and proving Amber Heard is a disgusting liar over and over again through her. And one of the major features, so when you're trying to look for lies, it's not just enough to have one indicator, you have to have a cluster. This is his number one rule. But one of the indicators is a big one, is that when peeps lie or are making stuff up whole cloth, they add a lot of irrelevant secondary details. So if Paul and Mark were lying, they wouldn't give this toned down, non-exaggerated account like we have. This is a proof of authentication that it did happen, that there were appearances. Even in the case of Mark, when there's no narrated, it's implied, and just that toned downness proves that there were resurrection appearances. So you can get that minimal fact, at least. That couldn't be made up, because if it was, there would be a whole bunch of secondary details. We would get the two angels, no grave clothes and stuff like that right from the beginning. It wouldn't develop if it was a total lie. So behavioral science actually backs up the Christian in the sense of establishing, at the very least, a minimal facts approach, right? So it might not be good if you're a Christian and you're taking a moderate facts or a maximal facts approach and you want these secondary details. If there is this exaggeration or development that's proven, and we're just assuming that for the sake of argument, well then, okay, well that'll be a problem because it's not in these details aren't in the earliest accounts. But nonetheless, behavioral science does back up the minimal facts approach, at least, and perhaps a moderate facts approach, depending on what facts are part of your moderate case. This proves true to life. This is exactly what we would expect, not from myth, but from peeps having a real event and then doing their thing over time, developing it and adding little nooks and crannies and little bits and pieces. So yeah, this is actual proof scientifically that the appearances are not a lie. They are a historical datum. So if Caleb the Atheist, my point here, if Caleb the Atheist's point is to try and say, well, because of this trend of exaggeration, which we're just granting for the sake of argument, as I said, don't do that. There are credible answers to all of this and refute this type thinking, at least to some extent, or to the way Caleb's trying to argue. But if we just grant it, it's still not a problem, because that still proves, that follows what we know scientifically of the way liars operate when they're just making stuff up. No, the fact that it's so toned down right to begin with, it proves that it's not just made up. There was this historical core, and then people did what they did after the fact, perhaps. So yeah, those are the 2 points I wanted to say about this part. So let's move on.
It says, oh, but I can eat and touch me. Now you don't have to doubt. Now they believe. John does a very similar thing with the grave clothes. Again, the grave clothes immediately folded. Jesus appears to them, resolves their doubts. Thomas says, no, I won't believe. Jesus appears to Thomas. He touches Jesus. He believes. And so we see this theme of explaining away why the body couldn't be stolen, explaining away why the doubts weren't important, explaining away why Jesus wasn't merely a ghost. And we know from people like Celsus that early Christians were being accused of seeing ghosts. And so these seem like apologetic, legendary exaggerations being added on in the later Gospels that we don't see in our earlier sources. So given that we know that the Gospels do this in other places, this is the better hypothesis as far as explaining these as legendary and not authentic. But even if we were to take a lot of these passages as written, or at least as some historical core, they're still problematic. As we said, there's a theme of doubt across all of them, and that's really strange. If they're saying Jesus, why are they doubting? If they saw Jesus and doubted, then how about people who don't see Jesus and have doubts? How, if the disciples aren't able to overcome this, how else would you be able to as someone who's not seen the risen Jesus?
So I just want to pause it here on this point. So the theme of doubt, this is somehow proof. This is something that, again, I'm shocked. Again, Caleb, if you're trying to make the best case you can for atheism, I don't think that this is a point you should include in the atheist case against the resurrection, because this is the theme of doubt is actual proof that this is a real historical event. So in the first place, criterion of embarrassment, it could be argued to be embarrassing that peeps are doubting and the apostles are doubting that these are happening, right? So it's not something you would just make up if it wasn't real to what happened with these resurrection appearances. But more than that, again, behavioral science, right? Psychology, the theme of doubt proves that this is real more so than a made up appearance, because and it just says some doubted, right? Not everyone, not a lot of doubt, but there were some people who doubted in certain situations, and we have those narratives. Well, that's exactly what I would expect if this was a real resurrection appearance. And funnily enough, later on when we get to Caleb's case, Caleb the atheist is going to point out other cases. And again, what's there? Doubt, kind of thing, right? Including cases he thinks are veridical or something like that. So doubt is a mark of authenticity. I mean, that's just normal. I mean, number one, well, what is it that they doubt? What are they doubting? Why are they doubting? I mean, they saw people doubt for all sorts of reasons and doubt all sorts of things, even if they're seeing the resurrected Jesus right before their eyes. You know, for the most natural reaction in the world when you're seeing something incredible, I can't believe it. I can't believe my eyes. Is this real? Am I? What's going on here? The ancients were the same way. So of course, some doubted. That proves literally nothing against these resurrection appearances at all. Yeah, at all. And in terms of Caleb's theological point that I think is totally irrelevant to the resurrection hypothesis, well, what about people that didn't see Jesus? And, you know, obviously they would have doubts too. Yes and no, right? I mean, obviously it depends on whether the inner witness of the Holy Spirit was stronger in them. I mean, seeing isn't necessarily believing. We've gotten proof in that in the Gospels all over the place, right? So that's the point, is you need to be a real seeker and a reasonable person. And sometimes people aren't. And because of that, they fail to accept the witness of the Holy Spirit, or they fail to accept their own senses, what they're seeing. They'll explain it away. They'll doubt. They'll, you know, out of a sinful nature, they'll come up with, oh, I was just dreaming or something like that. But yeah, this is a mark of authenticity to my mind, the fact that people are doubting. But again, he gives three different passages. It depends on, yeah, well, what are the details of the doubt, and what are they doubting? Why are they doubting? Some more needs to be established here. Just the fact that Gospels like Matthew 28 mentions that some doubted proves nothing to my mind. Okay, so let him continue here.
Jesus. Another issue is that the appearance is really inconsistent. So sometimes Jesus is recognized, like in Matthew 28, no indication he's not recognized there. But in Luke, they don't recognize on the road to Emmaus, and in John, Mary doesn't recognize him. Originally, she thinks he's the gardener. Sometimes he appears a glorious vision from heaven, like he does with Paul, or the Transfiguration, or in Revelation with John, or when he appears to Stephen in Acts or Ananias. But other times he appears just as kind of a mundane, ordinary guy, like in most of the gospel narratives, where he is mistaken for another person. They don't even notice. Sometimes other people can see him, which is implied in like when Paul sees him on the road to Damascus, or the group appearances in the Gospels. But other times he's only seen by one person, like when Ananias or Stephen see him in a heavenly vision. It doesn't imply that other people there can actually see it. It's all in their head. So we get these very inconsistencies. And if this is some kind of hallucination, we would expect these to be inconsistent, to be contradictory. Whereas if this was all from an objective reference, we'd expect more consistency. And so these inconsistencies are evidence partially against the resurrection of Jesus. And to go into this next slide, the appearances usually occur in poor conditions. So to show you what I mean by that, Paul doesn't give a specific description of the appearances, so he's not very helpful there. Matthew mentions a brief appearance to the women, and then the appearance on the mountain is from far away. When Luke has it, Jesus is not recognized by the people on the road to Emmaus at first. And then when he appears to the disciples, it's in very dim lighting in evening, with under candlelight when he's eating with them. And then John has Jesus unrecognized from a far distance away, and he's unrecognized by Mary Magdalene. He appears again at night with the disciples when he eats with them. The appearance to Thomas is very brief and doesn't go into much detail. It just kind of cuts off. And then in John 21, which is the picture there, he's seen from a far distance away to where they don't know it's Jesus at first. So although, there are examples where you could say, well, this is a longer appearance, the point is that a lot of these could be mistaken, could be brief flashing moments of uncertainty. And so when we're looking at memory, we want people to recognize the persons involved. Now, the disciples knew who Jesus was. Cleopas didn't know what Jesus looked like, though. And of course, Jesus is also often unrecognized when he is raised from the dead, which is a strange detail. We want long events that are not overly brief. Most of the resurrection appearances from the Gospels seem to be fairly brief and non-descriptive, with the exception of perhaps John 21 and the appearances of the disciples when they're eating. We want proper vantage and lighting. Again, a lot of these happen where they're either from a far distance or in really dim lighting where details can't be determined. We want normally toned situation. There's no adrenaline, stress, or high intensity. Although that does apply to most of the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb does seem to be a very frantic event that people rushing back and forth and confused and stressed about because they don't know where the body is, and that's distressing. So with certain details on that, one can be suspicious. And we want non-mundane events that are worthy of memory. So something that's not mundane. So admittedly, a resurrection would fall under that. But because the resurrection appearances don't fit all of these criteria, these would probably not be admissible in a court of law today. They would be considered, inapplicable. And it's these kinds of testimonies and bad conditions that get people wrongfully convicted on eyewitness testimony. So all that needs to be taken into consideration.
All right, so that's it for this part here. So yeah, on the inconsistency part, where did he put that? Okay, so the appearances are inconsistent. So once again, yeah, that's in all of their detail, secondary details and that sort of thing. So it doesn't necessarily matter. One thing I would like to say, so in terms of, this is where the differences in approach, my approach is vastly superior to what Caleb is doing here as a Christian apologist, lumping all the appearances, of Jesus together. And then and I find that Christians do this too. They just want to lump, because they want their cumulative case. So they just want to lump all the appearances together as though that's one fact. And then they pick and choose a point that's applicable, right? And I find that leads, it's a mishmash. And that's why I don't like it. I like separating individual facts, all the factors relevant to that individual appearance or fact, establish all of that, including its secondary details, if any, and then we go to the explanatory level. But with this, it's kind of, he's kind of, okay, well, I can pick and choose. There's a problem with this appearance over here, and we're just going to make it seem like, but that issue didn't apply in this appearance, so that somehow invalidates all of them. Because we would expect all the resurrection appearances to be consistent. I don't see why would that be the case? Why would they have to be consistent in the specific ways that you're specifying? So, for example, and it could be the case that we would expect them to be consistent, but again, Caleb the Atheist didn't bear the burden of proof. He didn't explain to us why in this. And it's just a 1 hour clip. So Caleb, the Christian, I'm not giving you a hard time here, but I'm just trying to make it clear for the audience that if this is a real atheist case and they're going to be developing their full argument, they need to give these details. You can't just assert that, well, some appearance narratives have secondary factors that are inconsistent to other appearances, secondary factors. So therefore, since they're inconsistent, they're both false. No resurrection appearances happened or something like that. And I just don't see why that would be the case at all. So, okay, sometimes Jesus is recognized, sometimes he's not. I will admit that this was a bit of an issue for me. But again, the fact is Jesus was recognized in 99% of the cases, I would say, right? He mentions people that didn't know him beforehand, or that he thinks didn't know him beforehand. Anyways, Clopas, even if that's true, Clopas would have had another appearance as an apostle after the fact, and he would have recognized Jesus. And at the end of the Emmaus Disciples Road thing, at the end, they all did recognize Jesus, and they were given supernatural proof through a properly basic belief, the witness of the Holy Spirit, that was in fact Jesus, if they didn't know him beforehand. So the recognition thing is fully checked off. Maybe they didn't necessarily have to recognize him from, I saw him and talked to him beforehand. Obviously, in order to be an apostle, you had to follow Jesus through his ministry. So they wouldn't be prime candidates if what Caleb the Atheist is saying there. But yeah, in some cases it says they didn't recognize him, at least initially. Is that an issue? Does that prove that somehow the resurrection didn't happen? No. Does that prove that all the resurrection appearances are false? No. Even assuming that this is an issue, right, where we have to eliminate the resurrection appearances where they didn't initially recognize Jesus for one reason or another. And I don't grant that. I think that's a false assumption on the atheist part. Even if we do grant that, what about the option that, okay, well, one of the appearances is true and the other appearance is false? What should the falsity? I mean, Caleb's an atheist here. We don't have to assume Christian presuppositions. And in fact, it's not even a Christian presupposition, because they're liberal Christians or other Christians, people like Rainbow Peter, for example, who might be open to saying, well, who cares about the resurrection appearance to the Amos disciples? Let's pretend that's totally made up. That's a false, that never happened. It got in the Bible, that's an error, but that doesn't prove that Jesus didn't appear to the 12, or that he didn't appear to the women, or didn't appear to Paul. As long as we have proof for that individual fact, that counts as positive evidence. It doesn't matter unless you establish why it should be an all or nothing case. No, it seems perfectly reasonable or plausible to me that maybe a miracle happened, and there were certain facts that can prove that miracle happened. And then after the fact, people made up appearances. Oh, hey, I want to be on the in club. I'll just make claims. I mean, look at Simon the Sorcerer or whatever. In AD the Bible, he's, oh yes, I've got the Holy Spirit. I believe. He's pretending he wants to be on the in club and stuff like that. So that's a perfectly realistic outcome, if you're open to accepting that there may be some resurrection appearances that aren't historical. And there are some Christians who can go down that route. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing case. Or if it does, Caleb the atheist needs to establish, why is this the case? Why is the appearance to the 12 falsified just because some people claimed a resurrection appearance later on to other people who claimed they didn't recognize him, or didn't recognize him initially? They recognized him afterwards, right? Yeah, so I think that you need to establish that, otherwise your case fails. The other thing, so being glorious from heaven. So no, there's not a single resurrection appearance. This is just a falsehood on Caleb the atheist's part. There is not a single resurrection appearance. And remember, in part 2, I explained the difference between an appearance and just a mere vision. There's nothing that pictures Jesus as a glorious being from heaven. And this plays a role in my explaining why the resurrection must be a supernatural miracle or a religious authenticating event, based on the expectation that a resurrection body would be glorious, white or dazzling lights or something like that. And they just had all the appearances of Jesus were just mundane. There's not a single one that's glorious. And what is it he goes to? He goes to the transfiguration. Well, if you're a Christian, you must be scratching your head. Transfiguration? That's not a resurrection appearance. So what Caleb the atheist here is doing is he's appealing to, without giving you the background knowledge, he's appealing to atheistic biblical scholars who try to say, oh, well, the transfiguration is a resurrection appearance. It's one of the early ones. And then because that didn't fit with a bodily resurrection, according to these skeptics' minds, they changed it and changed the context into a pre-resurrection transfiguration story that we have in our gospels today. This is sheer speculation. I've looked into this I've looked into this claim of skeptics in absolute detail. It's absolutely false and proven to be false. The transfiguration is not a resurrection appearance in any way and does not count as a glorious resurrection appearance. And I went into exquisite detail proving that when I was studying the resurrection in Coming to Faith. In Revelation, talking about a vision to John, that's not a resurrection appearance in any way. So visions don't matter whether he appears glorious or not. All that matters is everything that the Christians qualified as a quote unquote appearance of the risen Lord, which happened in 30 AD to a limited group of people for a limited time and then stopped permanently for all time. Couldn't have happened in 95 to 96 AD when John was having his revelation, apocalyptic vision from God on Patmos. I'm just going to have to say this is just flat out false. Or at the very least, Caleb, if you're going to mention this, I think that the best case an atheist would do is you should have at least mentioned there's some controversy here, and then just gave him like a quick note as to why you think the atheist case is right, is that, oh, something like the transfiguration is in fact a resurrection appearance, if you think that, or given their best argument, that at least some kind of thing, because otherwise I'm just stating it. He appears a glorious being from heaven. No, he doesn't. Absolutely false. So this one is interesting. Appearances usually occur in poor conditions, and then he gives some conditions that he says don't fit. So bad conditions for memory. So I like this. So have I gone too far? Yeah, so here it is. So with this list, I find it interesting that Caleb, in the first place, treats this as though this is a necessary and sufficient checklist for conditions for good memory, and it's not. We can absolutely prove that you don't need to check off every single one of these in order to be considered either a witness in a court of law. I just watched a show last night that disproves this list on ABC. So this is obviously false. And secondly, we have absolute proof from psychologists. I mean, Richard Bauckham's done a lot of work proving the Gospels do fulfill the conditions for accurate memory. They're oral history, not oral tradition. There's a major difference there. That doesn't necessarily apply to this debate about the eyewitness memory itself, but even with the eyewitness memory, we can prove that these certain facts are in fact historical. Therefore, we know that the memory was preserved. So number one, yes, it has to be a non-mundane event worthy of memory. Correct, yeah. Normally a tone situation, okay, great. Caleb, the atheist, said that most of the appearances qualify under this, although there may have been one at the empty tomb, like the appearance to the women may have been high stress or something like that, is what he says. Okay, so remember, this is a collective tradition, right? Collectives correct each other through the social dynamics, which will come into play later on at the explanatory level. So yeah, just because one appearance or even a couple appearances, again, the only one he mentions is the one at the empty tomb. So I'm just going to assume he thinks just that one was failing this criterion. You can still remember stuff even in those situations, and definitely you would remember the main things, even if you're getting secondary details wrong or your perception is distorted. And in fact, the fact that this is the case, he answers his own question. Why didn't they recognize him at first? Again, they're stressed out. Their attention focus is elsewhere. I mean, we're amazed. It's been scientifically proven. We've done experiments where if our focus is not properly on something, our peripheral vision is horrible. And we totally, something obvious. I mean, people have playing basketball and they tell you to count how many white players, not white skin, but white t-shirts versus black t-shirts throw the ball. How many times do they throw the basketball to each other? And you got to count, and you're so focused on that, you miss a freaking purple dinosaur or some guy in a huge outfit. Like, did you see the purple dinosaur? No, we didn't. How the heck could you miss that? So this is scientifically proven about this, and this provides some explanation as to why Jesus would appear to Mary and she wouldn't mistake him for the gardener at first. How was she even looking at him or just listening to him? I mean, what awoke her when it seems to be something Jesus said when the lights were opened and stuff like that. So I think that this criterion was fulfilled for most of them. Proper vantage and lighting. Again, which appearance are we talking about here? I'll just say this, it's not necessary. People can remember. And again, not having nice, even TV lighting is not going to affect your memory when you're seeing and talking and doing stuff with Jesus or whatever. So again, this all depends on what are the details, of the appearance in question. And this is why I like to split it up, because the proper vantage and lighting, the proper environmental factors may be an issue with some appearances, but not with others. It all just depends which one we're looking at. Long event, Caleb the atheist himself admits there were certain long events. What is it that qualifies as long? Going with this, I mean, Richard Bach, I'm surprised he doesn't have here repetition soon after the event. Repetition solidifies it in our memory. Again, this has been neurologically proven, right? The thing that we mostly remember is once we go over that event in our memory, that kind of solidifies. And if we keep talking about that, then it kind of solidifies in our memory. And this mitigates against his hypothesis about secondary details. The eyewitnesses would solidify in that initial retelling or in that initial remembering of the highly monumental event, at least in the major details. They can't get that wrong, whether it's a short event or a long event. Recognized persons involved, like I said, every single appearance, they recognized Jesus, either because they had remembered him before or through supernatural means with the Holy Spirit opening their eyes and them recognizing who he is. So this is just not an issue. Just because they didn't initially recognize him, there can be any numbers of explanations for that, such as, well, it's in a highly stressed situation with the women or Mary Magdalene. The Emmaus disciples seems to be a bit of an issue there where they don't recognize him. Did they know Jesus beforehand or not? Why don't they recognize him? Is there some kind of supernatural blinding? There are various explanations to explain the Emmaus disciples. By the way, one of which, for some Christians at least, if you're not a biblical inerrantist or if you're not an all or nothing resurrectionist, you can just, say, I don't believe the Emmaus disciples is historical. Certainly Mike Lacona will agree with you that we can't prove the appearance of the Emmaus disciples is historical. So maybe some Christians would say, okay, I don't believe the Emmaus, that's a made up appearance. That didn't happen historically. That does nothing. So who cares whether they recognized him or not? That does nothing to falsify whether the other appearances where they do recognize Jesus were proper eyewitness memory and historical. So yeah, I think more work needs to be done on this front. But yeah, if I would agree with this, that obviously these factors are preferable. So yeah, if you want to make the best case for the atheist, if you say, look, these are preferable, okay, that's great. And then point out which ones you think don't work. But this is why you got to split up the appearances and say, well, evaluate the appearance to Paul, evaluate the appearance to the women, evaluate the appearance to the Emmaus disciples. Can we prove there's a historical kernel and then secondary details? And then, okay, well, with the Emmaus disciples, which of these do they pass versus fail or something, and break it up like that? Okay. So now we're moving on to the explanatory level. Okay, so let's.
This testimony. So all that needs to be taken into consideration. And so when we ask about what about groups of people, can groups of people have hallucinations? Because if one person saw Jesus, that could be explained. We can't explain how 12 or more, or even 500 saw Jesus. Well, there are group experiences, especially in religious contexts, and group delusions. Marian apparitions, famously Our Lady of Fatima, but you can also look at Medjugorje and some other places where groups of people said they saw the Virgin Mary or some kind of heavenly vision in the sky at the same time. And this is some kind of optical illusion or hallucination or what have you. Same with statues talking, moving. There are stories in ancient Greece about talking statues, and there are actually inscriptions, people saying, we heard the statue talk. We have examples of people seeing statues of the Virgin Mary or Jesus blink or move, and this is seen by groups of people. And usually these have inconsistencies in the stories. Spring Hill Jack, which is pictured in the bottom right corner, was a really interesting kind of example of a mass hysteria in Britain where in the early 1800s, a woman claimed that she was attacked by a man who breathed fire at her and then was able to leap over a fence, hence the name Spring Hill Jack, because he could jump very high. And once this was reported in the newspapers, everyone started saying Jack. There were witnesses who were in who were in a carriage who saw Jack jump over the roof of a building. There were those saying Jack visited them at night and that he was bringing fire at them. And this got so bad that the mayor of London had to call like a state of emergency. Now, most scholars don't think that Spring Hill Jack actually existed. This was probably some kind of just mass experience. But the point is, these were multiple, polymodal experiences. People said that they could see, hear, and even feel the heat from Jack's breath on them, and this mass sense of panic. And yet, this didn't happen. This was all in their head because fear and publicity from these stories. The picture in the bottom left corner is actually a quite funny story from Alabama, of all places, of a group of people claiming to see a leprechaun. That's the artist's sketch. But you can look it up on YouTube. There's a video of groups of people saying, "Yeah, we all saw this leprechaun up in a tree," and they seem very adamant about it. So group think and group discussion afterwards can get people to think that they see something that's not there. Same with mass sightings of ghosts, and even group religious experiences in Pentecostal churches where they all feel the Holy Spirit on them at the same time. There's even a pastor who in the 1960s who claimed that Jesus appeared to his whole congregation and walked the aisles. And this was seen by dozens of people in a very strange way. So certainly experiences like this still happen in group settings. And here's an example of Mormonism, of all places, with Joseph Smith, of groups of people being collectively deceived. So this comes from Thomas Ford, who was the former governor of Illinois at the time, who heard this account about Joseph Smith, where he says, Joseph Smith assembled them in a room and produced a box, which he said contained the precious treasure, which was the golden plates. The lid was opened. The witnesses peeped into it, but making no discovery, for the box was empty. They said, Brother Joseph, we do not see the plates. The prophet answered them, O ye of little faith, get down on your knees, brethren, every one of you, and pray to God for the forgiveness of your sins. The disciples dropped to their knees and began to pray in the fervency of their spirit, supplicating God for more than 2 hours with fanatical earnestness. At the end of which time, looking into the box again, they were persuaded that they saw the plates. So we have here a group of people, after being suggested by Joseph Smith to pray sincerely for 2 hours, finally say, oh, we can see the plates now. Groups of people are seeing this, not just one person. So one can use the power of suggestion to make people believe this sincerely. All one has to do in this situation is switch out Joseph Smith for Peter and switch out disciples for the original apostles. And one can imagine Peter saying, I saw Jesus, get on your knees and pray, and you'll see him too. And you get plenty of other stories of people now saying, oh, now I can see Jesus. Oh, now I can feel the Holy Spirit, etc. We don't know that that's how it happened, but according to Paul, we can't rule it out. And bereavement visions of the dead are pretty common, and a lot of scholars talk about this, so I'll be pretty brief on it. But there are lots of good resources of this, especially Dale Allison's book on the resurrection has lots of examples of people seeing ghosts, and not just individuals, but groups of people. And sometimes they touch with them, sometimes they have conversations with them. Sometimes they don't even know they're dead until they vanish. Pretty much every combination you can think of in the Gospels. One example, and this comes from James Fedora's book, Unreasonable Faith, is example of Samuel Bull. Now, Mr. Bull died in 1931. In 1932, his family moved into his house, and they started seeing Samuel's spirit around them. Originally, this was seen by individuals, but as time went on, they started seeing these in group settings where multiple people were in the room and multiple people could see him at the same time. People investigating this case said that all members of the family together saw the apparition. Whenever the apparition was seen, all the persons were able to see it. Mrs. Bull also noted that her deceased husband spoke to her, so we have conversations. He called her Jane, so we have now not only a visual hallucination of the eye, but also an auditory hallucination, hearing conversations. And he laid his hand on her brow, and that he was solid when they touched him and quite lifelike. So we have seeing, hearing, and now touching in group settings. And this happened multiple occasions. This actually happened over the period of about a month, about 30 days, and then suddenly stopped, which is very reminiscent of very reminiscent of Acts, where Jesus appears in the 40 days, then suddenly stops, and then goes up into heaven, supposedly. So it's interesting to draw the analogies here, where we do have examples of groups of people seeing or hallucinating these, things that are not objectively there, where they are inconsistently seeing them and saying they see the same thing, hearing conversations, allegedly touching them. And this shows how much the power of suggestion comes. If you think, oh, I can see him, you can get other people to think they can see him and hear him and all this stuff too. And it's really scary to see what the power of suggestion can do in these situations. The most analogous example I could find is in a Hindu context, an Eastern Asian context, where we have an example of a ghost appearing to people, eating with them and having long conversations. So this comes from the autobiography of a yogi This was written, I believe, in the 1940s by a known author who is literate, whereas most scholars think the Gospels were written by anonymous authors using stories, second or third hand. So here we have an eyewitness testing to this allegedly happening. And I won't read all this out, but if you want to pause this and read it, it's basically the story of one of his gurus, one of his yogis, Indian teachers. They're going on a mountainside and they basically summon his spirit. The spirit appears to them and they at first don't believe it's him, but they make a meal together. They sit down and eat with him and touch him. And then after having these conversations, having a meal, he eventually vanishes. And so this is an alleged eyewitness report of this. To my knowledge, I have no reason to think the author doesn't have a good reputation. I have no evidence that he's lying or is dishonest in other places, as far as I'm aware, nor do I know that having any motive to lie about this. So it's possible that this was a groupthink hallucinatory situation involving eating, touching, conversing with a dead teacher. It's not hard to think of analogies here, especially since we know this one came from eyewitness, where we don't know that the original gospel authors were eyewitnesses. One final point about the gospel author.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it at this point. Okay, so on the mechanistic level, so Caleb gives various examples. He says that there are certain naturalistic explanations that he thinks can explain, and it's obvious in what he has in mind here are not individual appearances, but he has group appearances in mind, because this is a favorite talking point of Christian apologists, and rightly so. This speaks to mechanism as to what could possibly explain these group appearances to the 12, appearance to the group of women, appearance to the 500, or the appearance to all the apostles, assuming those are all historical facts. Now, one thing, so in terms of these mechanisms and examples, right? So in the first place, I don't think that Caleb can prove that all the relevant facts are analogous in these cases, and that's a huge problem for trying to use these examples to prove that the resurrection appearances to the groups are not unique. They have to have all those same relevant facts. So one major case in point as to a fact that I know he's going to bring up next, so I'll bring it up here, is, well, okay, these people are just lying, right? With the case of the Mormons, I think that we have pretty strong evidence and proof that these people were lying. They weren't deluded. They weren't innocently mistaken. They didn't see it. They weren't talked into it through social contagion. They were just lying. They were bullied through normal peer pressure, and they were known frauds. They retracted their claims later on. Joseph Smith was a known fraud. So yeah, this creates a major disanalogy with the appearance to the 12, for example, who we can prove, not necessarily that they died or were martyred for their beliefs in the resurrection, but that they were willing to die, or not, if not that, willing to suffer for their specific belief that Jesus had appeared to them, that they couldn't be lying about. They either knew it or happened or didn't. These guys, the Mormons, they recanted their BS when times got tough and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that it's very improbable, and that's a major disanalogy. Well, okay, I won't speak about that yet until Caleb gives his case, but look, that's at the very least, that's a major disanalogy. The resurrection appearances are totally unique to this Mormon experience. And, what about the other appearances? Spring-heeled Jack, mass hysteria kind of thing, right? People are lying to get in the newspapers once a fad takes off. I saw a documentary on him a few years back. It was a fascinating thing back in the 1800s. But yeah, I mean, people are just making stuff up, lies, like today's Bigfoot sightings. One guy cites a Bigfoot in an area, and then all of a sudden, oh my God, I saw him too. Yeah, me too. I was coming by. You get these little mass hysteria. That's the perfect explanation. We have no proof that these people are being truthful or don't have some kind of motive to lie or something like that. At the very least, we can't prove that they're telling the truth in all of these cases. So yeah, you would have to rely on some kind of argument, a principle of testimony or something, and just assume, well, there's so many people claiming to see him that at least some of them must be really truthful. In that case, the lying explanation would work. But again, there's no nuance, there's no coverage of in depth of these cases for us in this video for us to get into that. Another major issue is mass religious experiences. So right away, coming from Caleb the Atheist, who I'm assuming, I'm not sure why we would, why these would, mass sightings of ghosts, for example. Right, well, that's a supernatural experience. So if you're only getting group appearances in supernatural settings, that's proof that a supernatural event took place with Jesus. So yeah, there's no reason given by Caleb the Atheist for us to assume that, well, the reason there are mass sightings of ghosts is because there's really ghosts or demons impersonating ghosts, perhaps, and people are seeing these in groups. Why should we rule that out? And that would just corroborate the resurrection hypothesis. That would prove that, yeah, the fact that only in these supernatural settings do group appearances take place proves that, well, the resurrection was a group appearance. The only thing I can think of, maybe Caleb the Atheist has some kind of weird case in mind where he's trying to say, well, it's more probable that this is a ghost sighting of Jesus rather than a bodily resurrection. Because remember, his hypothesis does specify that it has to be a bodily resurrection, not just a ghost sighting. So even if Jesus' appearance were supernatural, it was just a ghost or something like that. Maybe, and that's enough to falsify the resurrection hypothesis. But again, I just don't know. It wasn't specified as to how this is relevant to Caleb's hypothesis. So because of that, I don't know how to respond. I would respond differently depending on what he's doing with these facts. And same with Marian apparitions, all that stuff. Group religious experiences in Pentecostal churches. Again, which ones? I've witnessed them myself. They're fakes. There is nothing truthful in that place, and I know for a fact, 100%, no doubt in my mind. Is he implying that there's some where they're actual real? Okay, well, what are the group religious experiences that he has in mind? Yeah, I think that social contagion and peer pressure are powerful agents. It can get people faking it, clucking like a chicken, and then lying and pretending that God was doing, or the Holy Spirit was doing something. So yeah, that happens, but how is that analogous to the resurrection appearance? Stuff like that. Again, these guys were willing to suffer for what they said they witnessed. I've never seen a Pentecostal church member go to bat for clucking like a chicken and saying that was really the Holy Spirit. Nobody's holding a gun to them and saying, are you sure? Yeah, recant, or I'm going to kill you. Nobody does that. Or I'm going to take away all your money or something like that. So, yeah, the group appearances. Again, this was an argument, I think, on a mechanistic level. Gary Habermas, Michael Kona, they've done a lot of work. I, back in the day, did a lot of work. I actually consulted world's experts in hallucinations and psychology to see if this argument works. I do think that it defeats the atheist. I think that the fact that there was a group appearance to the 12 that was close up and recognizable, so those are the additional details I need beyond just he appeared to the 12. Close up, recognizable, and mundane or non-glorious in nature. And if we can also prove additionally that he appeared to them as a group simultaneously, then yeah, that proves, look, we know scientifically and psychologically you can't have group hallucinations. They're like dream. You can't have a group dream. People just experience things individually. Now, obviously, social contagion and coordination does play a role after the fact. But the fact is nobody's seeing the exact same thing, right? You can tell people what you're seeing. You can influence them, and that could align what you're seeing to some extent, but nobody's experiencing the same hallucination. That's a scientific fact. Secondly, we have to distinguish between a hallucination, an illusion, and a delusion. And I would like Caleb to kind of specify what those are and what he thinks specifically applies to which appearance. This is why, again, my method of breaking things up into individual appearances before going into the cumulative case, where after we analyze the individual appearances or facts in isolation or explanatory isolation as best we can, then only then do we assess the conjunction of all the facts. What's the likelihood that the conjunction of he appeared to Peter in some way and he appeared to thing, and obviously the less ad hoc criterion becomes relevant. The simplicity becomes relevant as you have to postulate different mechanisms applying to different to explain different facts and how those fit together. Could those all work together, right? So sometimes they're conducive, sometimes they're not. But for example, one might say, oh, well, I think an illusion applies to certain appearances where they saw Jesus far away or something like that. Maybe that applies to some appearances, but not others. So you have to apply, okay, well, maybe a group delusion applies to the appearance to the women or something like that. And then a group hallucination applies to the appearance to the 12. Okay, well, let's say individually, all of these explanations work for explaining those facts. I don't think they do in all cases, but I'm just saying, if they do, well, does positing the conjunction, well, women had a group delusion and all the apostles had an illusion that they convinced them that Jesus rose from the dead, and the appearance to the 12 had a group hallucination. Well, now it's maybe starting to look a little bit ad hoc, or maybe you think that's improbable for that conjunction of naturalistic mechanisms to all be conspiring together within a short time. You could maybe argue that way or something like that. One thing I do want to play, so in terms of the group hallucinations, so let me just play a little clip from J.P. Holding about the hallucination hypothesis, because he hints towards the end at an argument or an angle that I use. So let me just play that clip first.
We now begin looking at alternative explanations to the resurrection of Jesus. We'll start with one of the more popular ideas. What if the disciples of Jesus were just seeing things? There's a vast body of literature on the subject of hallucinations, and a corresponding set of literature on how this allegedly explains why the disciples saw the risen Jesus. In my book on the resurrection, I have two guest chapters, one written by a physician and the other written by a psychologist. They discuss why variations on this theory won't wash from a medical or psychological perspective. I can't do their work full justice in these vids, but I'll raise a more nuts and bolts type of rebuttal that also puts paid to the hallucination hypothesis. Even if the disciples had a mass hallucination of Jesus, they would not have interpreted it as being Jesus resurrected. There was instead something entirely different that would have occurred to them had a vision of Jesus appeared to their eyes. The disciples would have had an expectation, if they had any at all, of Jesus ascending into heaven. This prediction of the rising would have been understood by friend and foe alike in terms of his body being taken to heaven, in the same way that Elijah's was. This explains why the Sanhedrin leaders demanded that the tomb be guarded. Their own concern was that the disciples would steal the body and claim that it had ascended to heaven. This also explains why John says the following. How could John have believed, yet also not have understood about the resurrection? It was because he and the other apostles were not expecting a resurrection. They were expecting an ascension of the body into heaven as a sign that Jesus' life had been brought to an orderly conclusion and that he had been vindicated by God. This also explains why Jesus had to tell Mary what we see here. All parties knew that Jesus predicted the body would be missing. What they didn't get the point on was the mechanism, because there was no room in their belief system for a specific resurrection prior to the general one of all men. So what would anyone seeing the risen Jesus have assumed they were looking at? Our answer comes from a place you might not expect. This passage reflects a Jewish belief in this era that people had guardian angels who were their exact twin. Notice that this is confirmed by Luke 24:37, where the disciples assume that the risen Jesus is a spirit, not a ghost of some sort, but a guardian angel.
Okay, so that's good enough there. But the point I wanted to make, so number one, he hints at a different mechanism that I use based on expectation, right? So when it comes to the appearance to the 12 specifically, this is the only fact in explanatory isolation that I think works to prove the resurrection hypothesis, or at least this was my assessment as of 4 years ago when I converted to Christianity. Maybe that's changed now if I relook at the evidence. And I plan to do that, by the way. So after I finish my Shroud solo series and finish the case from the Shroud of Turin, the next thing in terms of Christian evidence is for premise 11, I'm going to be going at the historical evidence for the resurrection and proving my arguments in my case. And that. So right now I'm just going based off my memory from 4 years ago when 4 to 5 years ago when I was delving hardcore deep into this stuff and just going based off memory. But there were two arguments, right? So the first one is the one that Caleb the atheist is responding to here, which is a mechanistic argument and or perhaps a uniqueness type argument, by saying that, well, Jesus appeared to the groups simultaneously all at once, and he did various things to authenticate that they all saw at once. And Christians will say, well, that's impossible to happen, naturalistically speaking. And I agree with that. I think that argument works. And I'm going to link to an article by Dr. Gary Habermas, a clinical paper with a clinical psychologist. Again, I've worked with world's experts in hallucinations myself, as have Mike Lacona and Gary Habermas, and they all confirm this, that, yeah, you wouldn't get a group hallucination. These just don't work, or are at the least very improbable to work. And I think that's a successful argument, but it is weak. There are counter responses to this. There are certain cases that make you think as good atheistic counters. So this isn't my favorite argument, believe it or not. I think it's good. I think it contributes to a cumulative case. It's more probable than not, but it's not like, oh, it's case closed. So I came up with a second argument that I think is a little bit stronger than the simultaneous group appearance. And so therefore, I don't even have to argue that the appearance to the 12 was a simultaneous group appearance. Pretend it wasn't, I don't care. I can still prove that at the very least, the majority of those remaining apostles of the 12 had an appearance that they believed was of the risen Jesus. Again, I have to also prove it was close up. So that would rule out illusions. They didn't see someone far away and just get an illusion and think it was Jesus because he kind of looked similar. Meanwhile, it was a random peep. It's close up. It was recognizable for them. Secondly, and then thirdly, it was mundane. So it was non-glorious. And this is what he hints at, the Jewish expectations of the time. If you're going to be resurrected, you're going to be resurrected in a glorious resurrection body. It's going to be shining in light. We have plenty of examples of this. Shining in light, wearing white clothes or whatever. You're not going to have your wounds and all this stuff. None of that. Every single resurrection appearance, dull, mundane, just an earthly appearance of Jesus. And that does not fit Jewish expectations of a resurrection. So therefore, I say it can't be hallucinations or some kind of psychological naturalistic explanation that it accounts for this type of appearance, given again close up, recognizable and non-glorious in nature. And that's kind of my argument. And remember, I kind of went over this with Caleb in private, and I couldn't remember. I'm remembering a little bit now more of how I was arguing five years ago or so. So the argument is, look, and there's debate on this about whether they would have an expectation. I can prove they would. William Lane Craig's done work on this and stuff like that they would have this entrenched expectation of seeing a glorious resurrection body. Now, here's the way this argument works. So Caleb the atheist would respond back by saying, yes, but there are cases where sometimes people, it's rare, but sometimes people do have hallucinations that are contrary to their expectations. And I have to admit, yes, there are in fact cases like this. Oops, so have I forfeited the argument? No. And this is where Caleb the atheist is going to help me out with his group delusions and social contagion explanation, because of these mechanisms, this proves it couldn't be that. Because maybe you could say one or two perhaps had hallucinations that were contrary to their expectations in this way. But I think if we can argue, and I have, that historically we know the majority of the 12, at least 6 or more of the 12, had to have a hallucination or an experience that they thought was an appearance in order to convert the others and stuff like that. If we have that, then at least one of them would have had a glorious resurrection appearance, hallucination of Jesus. They would have seen Jesus gloriously. And then this is where the mechanisms of social contagion and group delusion takes over, but it would work in favor of the glorious things. It would be the people that saw the glorious resurrected Christ that would convince the others to say, yeah, I was wrong. No, I saw him, he was glorious too. It would not work the opposite way. You wouldn't convince the glorious resurrection hallucinator, regardless of the number, one or more, to become a mundane, saying, oh yeah, I saw him, he was just mundane, he looked like garbage, he looked like an earthly person or something like that, he had wounds in him and stuff. No. In this case, the atheists' arguments, the naturalistic explanations, work in favor of Christians and the resurrection hypothesis. If you're going to delude yourself, you're going to delude yourself in favor of your entrenched Jewish expectations, especially if you're getting that social contagion and that confirmation from your other colleagues saying, no, I saw, he was glorious, he was shining. And you're like, yeah, he was, yeah. That's the way it would work on a balance of probabilities. That's my argument. And again, I go into a massive amount of details on this, as you guys are, when I was studying this, 5 to 6 years ago, in coming to faith, I dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's when I was doing this originally. Right now, I'm just going based off memory from all those years ago, because I haven't looked at it since then. I've been focused specifically on establishing my shroud argument, and planning to do the historical evidence for the resurrection once that's completed. But yeah, so that in a nutshell is how the argument works, because the other mechanisms, if it was a naturalistic explanation in the form of multiple hallucinations individually, or even if it was a group hallucination, simultaneous group hallucination, whatever way you do it, the fact is group delusion and social contagion, as Caleb has it here, would take over, and it would favor the glorious thing. But that's not what we have. Every single resurrection appearance is favoring the non-glorious, mundane resurrection appearance of Jesus. And since we rule out mass illusion or other naturalistic interpretations because of the features that it's close up and recognizable, therefore this proves this was a supernatural appearance in my mind. So that's how my argument works there in a nutshell. That just wanted to bear in mind that there are two different arguments based on two mechanistic type arguments against hallucination. You don't have to necessarily argue for a simultaneous group appearance. That I think that argument works. I'm in favor of it. I think that is part of a cumulative case. But even outside of that, we have this secondary argument, mechanistic argument based on the glorious expectation and the non-glorious nature of the resurrection appearances, regardless of whether they appeared to the majority of the 12 as groups simultaneously or as multiple individual hallucinations. The fact is, the fact he appeared non-glorious proves it was not a naturalistic hallucination or psychological explanation. It was probably an objective appearance of the risen Jesus. So that's my take there. And by the way, if you wanted my final numbers for this secondary mechanistic argument, so I just looked it up. So yeah, it turned out to be 57.07% total that the appearance to the 12 proves the resurrection hypothesis is true, or that it was a G-belief authenticating event or a religion authenticating miracle of God. That's just that one secondary argument, mechanistic argument from the truth of the appearance to the 12 based on this non-glorious nature of the appearance and entrenched Jewish expectations at the time. So the other mechanistic argument was slightly less than 57%. It was still above 50%, but so combined, I think it was about 59 point something percent based on the appearance to the 12 that I believe the resurrection appearance, that the resurrection happened and that Christianity is true on the basis of the appearance to the 12, Jesus appearing to them. So yeah, I was being tremendously skeptical, as you can see, being too generous to atheists and skeptics in my assessment on this front at the time before I converted to being a Christian. And this is part of what played the role in my converting to Christ. This was one of the positive evidences. So yeah, I think it'll be very interesting once I get back into studying the historical evidence for the resurrection for my solo shows after I'm done with the Shroud. I can't wait to revisit this in hardcore detail again for that show and seeing where I am today, because I've definitely gone up given what I know in terms of the evidence for the Shroud. I want to see if the same will be true for the historical evidence for the resurrection as well. So yeah, let's move on to what Caleb has to say about martyrs now.
One final point about the gospel authors and the early Christians being sincere. Often apologists will say, well, all the disciples died, even though some of them will re-note that to say in Sean McDowell's case, Sean McDowell did a book on the martyrs and the apostles where we don't actually know that all the apostles died. We know they were at least willing to die, that they proclaimed this and were willing to suffer, but we can only confirm about 4 of them actually did die. But even granting that they were all sincere in their beliefs, that doesn't necessarily prove that they weren't lying. For example, you can die for a known lie if there is an underlying truth behind it. So an example would be lying to Nazis. So if a Nazi comes to your door and says, "Are you hiding Jews?" and you are, even though you are lying to them and you say, "No, I'm not," you're doing this because deep down you really are sincere in the belief that Jews should not be persecuted, that Jews are people with rights, and that I'm very convinced that these rights should be protected. And so if I have to lie to protect these rights, I will do that. And so people have been willing to go to be punished by the Nazis for such lies that they knew were lies, but they did because they had sincere beliefs underpinning them. And so one could say this with the resurrection. Theoretically, we can't prove this in either way, but it's possible that the disciples really believed Jesus was the Messiah, that he had great moral teachings, and that the only way to get people to believe this, because even Paul says that, well, a crucified Messiah, that's foolishness to us and a stumbling block to the Jews, to say, well, Jesus rose from the dead, and so he was the Messiah. Messiah didn't actually die. God reversed that decision. And so maybe the disciples were willing to lie about this. And they did this because they really did believe Jesus was the Messiah. They really believed they were doing a good thing, and that the only way they could get this message out is by lying. So even if they didn't believe he was raised from the dead, their sincere belief that professing this would lead to Christianity spreading could be the catalyst. So people might be willing to die in that case for a quote unquote known lie. We also have the example I put of Jim Jones, which I think is interesting. Jim Jones was a cult leader in the 1970s. I think he ended up having 800 people killed through drinking poison Kool-Aid because they moved to South America. It's a crazy story, but the short version is that he thought he was some kind of prophet and implied that he was God, and that these people believed him, and that he was speaking God's word essentially, and he was able to deceive all these people. And he would perform faith healings like a psychic surgery, which an example is down there, where he would allegedly take the tumors out of people and say, oh, you've been healed by my power. In reality, he was just using chicken gizzards and tricking people. So the point is, Jim Jones knew that at least part of what he was doing was fake. He knew that the faith healings weren't real, because he can't not know that and also be faking these with chicken gizzards, right? So he would have to know, at least in part, that what he was doing is not legitimate, that he was at least partially a fraud. But perhaps he didn't care. Perhaps he was convinced for other reasons that what he was doing was right to get this group of people together. And he ended up taking them to South America and Guyana, and they all ended up dying, including himself. He could have, said under persecution, well, okay, I made it all up. I'm not really a prophet. I fake my healings. Just don't hurt us. But he didn't. He took it to the grave. He stood by what he said. He doubled down, and he ended up taking the poison. And that's kind of the sad thing that happens with people in that state of cognitive dissonance. But this could be a potential example of someone dying for something they know is not true, because they would rather do that than admit they were wrong and take the consequences once they've already gone that far. The last part of this, and
all right, so last part of this on martyrdom. So yes, I think it's true. We can't prove that all the apostles died for their beliefs in the resurrection, or were martyred for their beliefs in the resurrection. I think that Dr. Sean McDowell has done a great job. I was lucky enough to work with him, and he sent me his work when I was studying the resurrection back in the day. So yeah, I think it's about 4 to 5 that you can make the case for, on a balance of probabilities, were martyred or something like that. And we had him on SNS. I invited him to come on SNS, and he went over some of that data. So you can listen to on Real Seekers, just search for Sean McDowell, and you can listen to that show directly. But yeah, it's nonetheless, who cares? We can prove, I think, and I've argued for this again in my research quite a bit, in quite a bit of detail back in the day when I was researching this as a non-believer. And yeah, we can prove that all of the disciples, or the vast majority of them, were at least willing to suffer and die for their belief in the resurrection specifically. And that's all that matters. I remember, there's controversy about that. Well, how do you know that how do you prove that they were actually willing to do so? I remember, for example, one of the atheists and skeptics, one of their claims from a scholar, actually, they tried to argue that, oh, well, actually, with Paul's persecution, for example, there's a case in point, there's proof they're willing to suffer or something, right? And they'll say, oh, but Paul was just persecuting Hellenistic Christians or Hellenistic Jews who converted to Christianity. He wasn't going after proper Jews. So actually, Peter and the apostles weren't afraid for their lives. They weren't willing to suffer or die. They could go on preaching. Paul didn't touch them. There was a separation. He was only targeting it like Philip and Stephen and stuff like that. Those types of Christians, non-proper Jewish Christians. Now, obviously, that I prove that that's complete rubbish. There are responses to that and stuff like that. But yeah, it's just, we can prove that they were, as Gary Habermas says, they were willing to suffer and even die. You can argue that for the sake of their resurrection belief. Now, Caleb, the atheist, I think raises a fair point that, yeah, people are willing to lie for a greater cause. This is something that, you have to admit and take into effect. The Jim Jones case is obviously, yes, he knew that there were certain lies in secondary details, and he was willing to die for that anyways, kind of thing. And that didn't detract from his obvious belief in the main cause. Now, this is the main thing that I want to critique Caleb the atheist on, because there's a total difference here. The resurrection, the apostles, or the 12, were willing to suffer and die for their main belief in the resurrection. It wasn't about, that was the greater good. They didn't think, oh, he's the Messiah, and he rose from the dead, and oh, we have to preserve the greater good of believing Jesus is the Messiah. No, the resurrection, their eyewitness testimony to the resurrection and witnessing of that, then is what led them to get proof that Jesus was the Messiah. Without the resurrection, they don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. Sure, Jesus did miracles and stuff like that, but that isn't The Bible never says, oh, they believed he was the Messiah because he did these miracles. No, it's he was the Messiah because God authenticated him from the dead by having him die and for our sins on the cross and then rise from the dead. The rising from the dead was the proof, uncompromisable. You can't negotiate. That is the fundamental reason for believing Jesus was God in the flesh or the Messiah. Without that, Jesus doing miracles, totally meaningless. He's still a crucified Messiah, did that with the help of Beelzebub and Satan. The apostles wouldn't care unless the resurrection happened. So it's different than Jim Jones. He can kind of overlook secondary details, but no, without that resurrection, there is no greater good to be had with the apostles. It's because and only the resurrection that could lead to these greater goods. That was non-compromisable. There was no secondary, it wasn't a secondary belief, it was the belief. And without it, you had no higher goods. It was done. You had a crucified false Messiah. Didn't matter his signs beforehand, irrelevant. They didn't believe in him as the Messiah because of that, not after seeing him crucified. They all ran away. They were depressed. It looked to them like he was fake. So yeah, I think that there's a disanalogy there that Caleb's not taking into account with someone like Jim Jones, who, okay, sure, oh, well, he would have been purposefully lying about certain secondary irrelevant things, but still maintaining his higher belief and giving it a pass on the secondary things and lying about them purposefully in order to maintain the higher good. Sure, that works with Jim Jones in that instance and other people. That doesn't work with the apostles in the resurrection. No, the resurrection was the reason, the only reason they believed Jesus was the Messiah or whatever. Without that, there was no higher goods to protect. There was no greater good or deeper cause, as Caleb the Atheist puts it here, that would sustain belief in the resurrection no matter what, or cause them to, yeah, sure, we know that he didn't really raise, but let's just lie about it because we know he's the Messiah. So, it's better to lie for that greater good. He was the Messiah. So let's just say, no. They wouldn't be claiming he was the Messiah. There is no belief that Jesus is the Messiah after he was crucified, if there was no resurrection. I think we can establish that. So that's a disanalogy here. Okay, let me have Caleb play off the last little bit of his video, and I'll just give a quick assessment. This is getting into the explanatory power.
Dying, including himself, he could have, said under persecution, well, okay, I made it all up. I'm not really a prophet. I fake my healings. Just don't hurt us. But he didn't. He took it to the grave. He stood by what he said. He doubled down, and he ended up taking the poison. And that's kind of the sad thing that happens with people in that state of cognitive dissonance. But this could be a potential example of someone dying for something they know is not true, because they would rather do that than admit they were wrong and take the consequences once they've already gone that far. The last part of this, and the most brief part, will just be, what is the best explanation, right? So can we say that the resurrection is the best explanation given all of this data? Well, even if we were to say, well, the resurrection is the simplest hypothesis, right? Because God raised Jesus from the dead explains all of this, whereas we have to take independent hypotheses to explain this. The resurrection still has lots of questions that are unanswered that don't help with explanatory power. So, for example, Robert Gregory Cabot and others will say, how was Jesus seen? Is a resurrected body even made of atoms? Does light reflect off of it or not? Because if we're going to say that it's not made of that, then we can't explain how they see him. And so we don't know the properties of a resurrected body. We can't really predict what that would look like. How can Jesus eat in the Gospels? Is he able to eat after resurrection? Does he have a stomach and intestines? Why would we need food to eat in the resurrection if we're immortal? Why would we even need food if we don't need food for nutrients and hunger if we're going to live forever? The whole point of food is to keep us alive. Where did Jesus go when he wasn't with the disciples in between them? He's able to vanish and appear. Was Jesus hanging out on an island somewhere? Was he in heaven when he wasn't on earth? But if he was in heaven, what's the point of the ascension then? And how does Jesus even ascend into heaven if he's in a body? Is heaven a physical place where, God is a body? Because if that's the case, then you get a lot of questions about contingency and cosmological arguments that presuppose God being this classical theist, disembodied perfect being without limits. But if heaven's this like physical place where God is an actual throne, that becomes a bit more complicated. And how does Jesus, is Jesus currently in a resurrected body in heaven? If it's a spaceless place, what does that even look like? How can a physical thing be in a non-physical place? When Jesus appears to Paul after he ascends, is he made of photons? Because Paul sees a light. How does that work? Why is Jesus sometimes recognized and sometimes not? What's going on there? Why does the resurrection hypothesis does not predict that Jews would be confused and not seen, but the hypothesis that these are hallucinations and spiritual experiences would predict that. You'd expect more inconsistency from these things. And where did the resurrected Jesus get clothes? This isn't mentioned that often, but Jesus was probably crucified naked, and it says that his grave clothes laid on the ground of the tomb. So where does Jesus get clothes? Did he go steal them? That would be problematic for him sinning. Did Jesus go buy them afterwards? That would mean the first person to see Jesus was not the woman after he was raised from dead. Did he just create clothes ex nihilo? Because usually in Hebrew literature, when God does, when angels have clothes or saints have clothes, it's in glory, it's white shining clothes, but Jesus doesn't have that until the ascension. He has regular clothes. So is God just producing clothes ex nihilo? Because we have to add that to our hypothesis. There's nothing in the resurrection hypothesis that says Jesus has to be clothed. He could be theoretically raised naked. So we have to add on to the hypothesis that Jesus is not only resurrected, but has the ability to be seen, has the ability to leave behind an empty tomb, has the ability to be clothed, has the ability to be change his appearance to where he's sometimes recognized, sometimes not, has the ability to eat, because he could have all these things and still not be able to eat. So we have to add on all these auxiliary hypotheses that don't really explain it. A better explanation for all these is just using dream logic. So whenever you're having a hallucination or a dream, you see a lot of weird things that don't make sense. And so you don't usually have to justify, that doesn't make sense. That's weird. I must be dreaming. Usually you just go with it and just accept that it's weird because your brain doesn't question it when you're in those kinds of psychological states. And so if these are just things being seen by people who are hallucinating or dreaming or having visions, they don't really have to explain it. They're just saying, yeah, I saw Jesus in this condition. He was able to. When you think it out logically, it doesn't really make sense, or at least we don't have explanations for it. But if these are just visionary experiences that don't really need to be explained because it's all within the person's psychology and not within the actual world, that's a much better explanation for all this rather than adding on these auxiliary hypotheses.
Okay. So this is it's hard to know what to say about this. Okay, so his fundamental conclusion is that dream logic explains all of this much better than the resurrection hypothesis. How? He's just posing a bunch of irrelevant secondary questions, right? These answers to these questions have not been provided by the resurrection hypothesis, and we have no need to address them in order to prove that the resurrection hypothesis is true. This is just fundamental logic. You don't need answers. You don't need to know all the mechanisms and stuff like that. So Caleb the Atheist seems to be adopting a common foolishness of fundally atheists, where they demand mechanisms for irrelevant bits and then they think that counts against the resurrection hypothesis. So in the first place, how is it more, okay, how is Jesus seen? Does light reflect a resurrected body? Yes. What's the problem with that? How is dream logic better than the resurrection hypothesis? Yeah, resurrected bodies reflect light the same way every other body does. Obviously, that's how our eyeballs saw it. Is that what's the problem there? If you answer that, nothing's more probable than not. How can Jesus eat? Does he need a digestive system? Presumably. How can Jesus? Yeah, he has a digestive system. Now it's kind of, I don't get this. I mean, he's saying, well, this is ridiculous that we would be. Why is it ridiculous? In the resurrected body, the whole point of resurrection is affirming God's original creation and it's being redeemed and that sort of thing. We're not going to be spirits, right? So, I mean, eating, yeah, we're going to continue to do that in the afterworld. It's not about living forever or not dying. That's not the only purpose for food. A lot of people eat food for pure pleasure. Guarantee you, I had a chocolate bar today. It was not about surviving. So, yeah, I think that there's going to be feasts in the afterlife, and we're going to enjoy. It's going to be something we're going to enjoy. So, Where's the implausibility in that? Or the lack of explanatory power? What are you saying here? I don't get it. Where does Jesus go in between? Okay, I don't know. I don't know doesn't lack explanatory power. Again, I don't have to answer this question in order to prove the resurrection hypothesis is true. I mean, there's lots of hypotheses with ancillary or secondary hypotheses or mechanisms that need to be attached that we just have to answer. I don't know. I mean, look at quantum physics. It's absolute proof that you don't need, it doesn't take away from the explanatory power of a cosmological model just because you're like, oh, well how does quantum physics operate? Is it a wave or a particle? Oh, you don't know. Oh, well, I guess you lack explanatory logic compared to dream logic then. I guess good old Caleb the Atheist here is dismissing all of cosmology and quantum physics because we don't have an answer, concrete answer to this mechanism type question. So a dream is by definition explains quantum physics all much better. No, that's not the way it works. How does a physically resurrected body ascend into heaven if heaven is spaceless? Again, read Craig Keener. Jesus is just doing that for the benefit of the people. Obviously, it's a different dimension or something like that this appears to. Is Jesus currently in a physical body? Yep. And Dr. William Lane Craig has explained this beautifully. You know, it's like a tuning fork, still there physically and everything like that, but in a non-physical realm like heaven, dimension or whatever, like heaven, it's kind of like a tuning fork in an airless environment. You know, the waves can't perpetrate or whatever. You don't hear any sound, but it's still there and stuff like that. How does the ascended Jesus emit light? Again, I don't know. I'm assuming maybe it's photons. You're talking about Jesus emitting light around him or something like that in Paul's appearance. Is it a supernatural light? Is it physical light? Again, it doesn't matter. I can just say I don't know. But what's the problem with saying, yeah, sure, it's regular light that's being emitted? What's the issue there? Why is Jesus sometimes recognized and sometimes mistaken in identity by those who see him? Who knows? Maybe there's naturalistic explanations, like I explained before with the appearance to the women. Maybe there's a supernatural explanation. I mean, what's implausible about an omnipotent God obscuring people's eyes and not to see things? I mean, there's any number of ways he could accomplish this for them not to see clearly enough to recognize Jesus or something. And then where did resurrected Jesus get his clothes? Good question. Thank you for asking, Caleb the Atheist. He, after he resurrected naked, he punched the gardener in the face, stole his clothes, and then ran from there. How about that? No, sorry. Sure. I mean, God created his clothes ex nihilo. Is that really a problem? How does that lack explanatory power? I mean, you've granted miracles, you've granted God. What on earth are you saying here? It doesn't make this less ad hoc. I mean, yeah, at the time of his resurrection, he was resurrected with clothes as well. Like, I don't even get how dream logic explains that better in terms of explanatory power. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not that impressed with this argument, to be honest. I think you're just raising a bunch of irrelevant questions that people can answer yes or no to, or we can even say, look, we don't know, and it does nothing, absolutely bupkis, in terms of falsifying the resurrection hypothesis proper. Yeah. All right.
They're just saying, yeah, I saw Jesus in this condition. He was able to. When you think about logically, it doesn't really make sense, or at least we don't have explanations for it. But these are just visionary experiences that don't really need to be explained because it's all within the person's psychology, not within the actual world. That's a much better explanation for all this rather than adding on these auxiliary hypotheses. And of course, background information, even if we grant that God exists, we still have to look at the probability of all the other evidence pointing against this. We do have lots of examples of mythological stories of other gods being resurrected and having missing bodies. We have examples of people seeing dead loved ones, including examples of people in groups and multi-sensory experiences. We have examples of people in group religious experiences and mass hysteria. We have well understood principles that memory can be faulty and eyewitness testimony and what conditions that does apply to. We know that bodies can sometimes go missing for a variety of reasons. We know people do hallucinate. People have dreams. People have religious visions that are not really there. We do know that on sometimes rare occasions, people do convert who were originally hostile to religion for other reasons. We know that people can be sincerely mistaken and die for false beliefs or even lie for other reasons. And so all of this it makes up our background information. So even
agree to all the background information. I think Caleb, the atheist, did a good job in establishing this. One thing that we know that people can hallucinate visions, especially in religious context. When did he prove that those were in fact hallucinations? He mentioned examples within religious contexts of groups of people seeing stuff. I remember that. I don't remember him proving that was an actual hallucination, not an objective appearance of a ghost or an objective appearance of some kind of religious hallucination of some sort. So yeah, I think he didn't present this in the video and prove his case. Maybe he has something in his own background knowledge that isn't presented in the video that substantiates this to his mind. I mean, I'm certainly open to it. I'm sure there is at least one example of somebody having a hallucination in a religious context. That can happen, I'm sure, but nothing was presented in the video that I remember, and certainly nothing in groups. But other than that, yeah, I agree to everything else on this list.
Even taking a combination of these requires less auxiliary hypotheses than the resurrection hypothesis does. And so all of this is in our background information, but we don't have any background information on what a resurrection body would look like, what a resurrection body would entail, what predictions we could even make with a resurrection body. So given that we have all these other natural mechanisms, the resurrection is just not a good explanation and doesn't explain the data that we do have. This explains the inconsistency of the appearances. This explains why Paul's appearance seems to be the simplest and John seems to be the most complicated, why we seem to have legendary growth, etc. So one can explain the resurrection through natural means that we have other examples of that's not entirely ad hoc or implausible. So the resurrection just fails as a good explanation. Lastly, I already said that. Yeah, we don't know the properties of resurrection body and so forth. So I have all that up there. So again, the resurrection is not a simple explanation, nor does it have a lot of explanatory power. The last thing I'll say with this presentation before I wrap up is kind of doing a negative alter call. Often when people
the resurrection hypothesis does not require for its truth answers to these auxiliary hypotheses, at least not unless Caleb establishes the case that this is somehow relevant to the truth or falsity of the resurrection hypothesis. I mean, knowing what properties a resurrection body has, or such as how is it seen, just doesn't matter. You can just say, I don't know. You don't have to have an answer to that. What Caleb has to do is try to prove that this auxiliary hypothesis somehow falsifies the resurrection hypothesis, because if you answer yes, it's seen in the way normal light is. Oh, well, that's problematic for some reason. Okay, then it's relevant. Or if a Christian answers no, it's supernaturally visible in some way. Oh, well, that's a problem because, what's your insert argument there, atheist? Insert evidence or reasoning there. And Caleb the atheist says he's just got blank. We just have brackets saying insert here, and there's nothing. So Christian is free to say, I don't know on all of this, and it does nothing to falsify the resurrection or to say that it's not simple, right? You have to understand how simplicity works as a criterion. I mean, a lot of times atheists and skeptics privilege quantitative simplicity over qualitative simplicity and that sort of thing, where they prefer the number of entities and stuff. What am I saying there? That's irrelevant. He's talking about qualitative simplicity here. But anyways, this is not the way it works in terms of auxiliary hypotheses. Those any and all auxiliary hypotheses have to be linked. You have to establish the link to the main hypotheses and prove that answers to those have to be answered in order for the truth of the resurrection hypothesis to be believed. And furthermore, that the answer that one gives to these auxiliary hypotheses is somehow problematic and or falsifies the main hypothesis. And again, Caleb didn't do that as far as I'm concerned. I don't see how dream logic is any more plausible or any more explanatorily powerful than positing God did it. God did it as a miracle and actually rose Jesus from the dead. I mean, we don't know how the resurrected Christ got clothes. Well, like that doesn't make it a more complicated hypothesis. So yeah, I don't know. I would need to talk to Caleb, the Christian, to kind of figure out what is he thinking here. Why does he think that these irrelevant questions, interesting but irrelevant in terms of the truth or falsity of the resurrection hypothesis, and why on earth, if he thinks, if a Christian says, "Yep, God made clothes ex nihilo," what's the problem? How does that have less explanatory power? I mean, it's God. Yeah, he's omnipotent. He has all powers, all capabilities. If he can raise someone from the dead, he can also create clothes, put those clothes in the same spatial location and spatial extension of the human body. What's the problem? I don't get it. So yeah, let's let Caleb finish off here.
I already said that. Yeah, we don't know the properties of resurrection, body, and so forth. So I have all that up there. So again, the resurrection is not a simple explanation, nor does it have a lot of explanatory power. The last thing I'll say with this presentation before I wrap up is kind of doing a negative altar call. You know, often when people do apologetics, they end it by saying, you know, here's the gospel, and if you want to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, go ahead. But as the faux skeptic here, and my be pretending to be a heretic for the moment, one can do a negative, a anti-altar call in this case. So usually we're looking at evidence, you know, in a court of law, the person is innocent unless they can be convicted beyond reasonable doubt. So my job here is not to say that we can prove the resurrection did not happen. All I'm trying to say is that here we have reasonable doubt, and that if this was a court case, we would not have enough evidence to convict. It could at least be, at best, be open up to say we're not sure either way, but it's possible. It's not so strong that we would have evidence to convict the person with, you know, potential consequences. Even Jesus described Christian.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so I've been looking at this slightly wrong, I guess. Like, so Caleb the atheist is saying that he's not trying to prove a positive hypothesis. I've been treating it as though he can prove the resurrection hypothesis is false on a balance of probabilities. And now he's just saying, no, I'm just raising this stuff to provide reasonable doubt. So we're assessing the Christian's hypothesis that the resurrection, God raised Jesus from the dead positively on the Christian's end. And then he's saying, but the Christian can't prove that beyond reasonable doubt. Or at best, he can't even prove it on a balance of probabilities. And everything he's set up to this point just establishes that you can have reasonable doubts, or you can be reasonable in suspending judgment. So that does put a bit of a different spin on how I would assess it. I would still find it problematic and stuff like that. I still don't think he's established his case in a lot of cases. I would probably agree with him that he's probably done enough to prove that the resurrection hypothesis can't be proven. I don't know. Again, I would, yeah, he's just bringing this up at the end. This is his goal. So I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. But for me, proven beyond reasonable doubt means it's proven to be true 95.01% or more. That's what I mean by proven beyond reasonable doubt. I think that's true to life, true to what we mean by that standard. Proof on a balance of probabilities, anything over 50%, 50.01% to 100% is proof on that level. Yeah, I don't know what to say, because again, I didn't assess this in that light, that his goal was just minimally to prove that the resurrection, the positive Christian resurrection hypothesis can't be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Yeah, I'm just going to leave that. I don't know if he's accomplished that minimal goal or not. All right, so let him continue.
Christianity as being one of consequence. It's not just a example of past cause wager where we just take it on faith and that we have nothing to lose and that you might as well believe to avoid potential hell. You know, Jesus even said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what would profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? What shall a man gain in return for his soul? So if one is to follow Christianity to the point, I don't just mean cultural Christians who say, yeah, I believe in Jesus, but I'm still going to live my life how I want, because I don't think most Orthodox Christians count them as legitimate Christians, nor does Jesus. Jesus in other places says, people will come to me and say, oh yeah, I was a follower of yours, and he'll say, depart from me, I never knew you. Jesus wants people to be sincere and to live their lives for him. But in order to do that, that requires a lot of sacrifice. This could be potentially devoting yourself to be clergy, part of a clergy or a missionary if you feel called to do that, or at least supporting people in those cases, giving them money, which could require lifelong vows of celibacy, devotion, poverty, potentially repressing one's sexuality if someone is part of the LGBT community or sexually promiscuous outside of marriage. It would require suppressing that and giving up that luxury in exchange for a promise that you don't know might happen, even being single your whole life if you were a priest. Giving part of your income to a church as well as the poor. Now, of course, it's great to help out the poor, but giving 10% of your income is a lot, and certainly people could put that money to better use in often cases. And so if you're supporting institutions that you're not confident that they are teaching things that are in fact true and real, you may be wasting that money that could be put to good use elsewhere. So that's a sacrifice. Living a modest lifestyle free from excessive wealth or monetary success. Jesus repeatedly seems to advocate people being moderately, poor, at least moderately wealthy, but not people having excessive money. So he's saying that, yeah, if you have a lot of money, you should give it away. You should be sincere in that regard. Potentially being willing to die for your faith and given the chance. There's plenty of stories of Christian missionaries, even today, who suffer for their faith and go under horrible torture. And people wasting opportunities for pleasure in this life with hope in the faith reward of an afterlife that's far from certain. We don't know if there's a heaven and all this stuff. So the point is that one does have a lot of risk to take by being a Christian. It's not a simple thing. Even C.S. Lewis, the famous Christian author, said, if you want an easier religion, I would not recommend Christianity. Jesus says the path is narrow. So one better have some really, really, really convincing evidence to dedicate their whole life to this. And all the purpose of this presentation is to show the other side and say, it's reasonable to have doubts. It's reasonable to say that we can't prove this beyond a reasonable doubt, even if it may be true. Is it worth the risks that we're taking here? Is it worth giving up all of that right now in this life that we know exists for something that potentially could be wrong, that we don't have really, really strong evidence for, especially in the absence of hell?
So okay, so this is interesting then. I didn't expect him to go here. And I don't have time to go into it, but okay, so for the most part, yes, in terms of the practical costs of believing in Jesus, yeah, this is right. You have to repress your sexuality. You can't have sex outside of heterosexual marriage. You have to giving a significant portion of your income to the church. Well, that's not true. I mean, you don't have to give a significant portion of your income and stuff like that. So I don't know. Yeah. Anyways, I get what Caleb means. Like, yeah, you have to be willing to give and to help people and your church and that sort of thing. And not just be a cheapskate or something. but yeah, so there are these practical costs, but notice what Caleb the Atheist said here. And I'm a little bit disappointed as a hardcore evidentialist, but he's advancing pragmatic encroachment theory here, like a lot of atheists and skeptics on the fundy level like to do. And they say, look, this is so, the costs of believing and committing to Christianity are so great on a practical level. The practical stakes are so high that for Caleb Jackson, maybe you can prove the resurrection hypothesis is true. He's granting it to you. It's Dale, you showed us your numbers. I said 59%. I was wrong. It was, let me bring that up again. So this, the appearance of the 12. So I did include both appearances here, right? My total was only 57.07%. So that was 55.09% for the non-glorious argument appearance to the 12 I gave, the Jake O'Connell type argumentation. And then 52.01% for the general uniqueness argument about group appearances, simultaneous group appearances, and that sort of thing. There should be a mechanism argument here, but so yeah, I got 57.07% on that front from those. 57% is too low according to Caleb the Atheist here. You need proof beyond reasonable doubt. And I, Dale, arbitrarily define that as 95.01% or more. I don't have 95.01% or more proven that the resurrection hypothesis is true on my front. Therefore, according to Caleb the Atheist, the practical stakes mean I haven't met the sufficiency threshold. I should not believe in the resurrection and or that Christianity is true on the basis of the evidence for the resurrection. I think this is complete foolishness. I am a hardcore evidentialist. When it comes to epistemology, I do not agree with pragmatic encroachment theory in that, even though it's understandable, I think it is illogical and irrational, epistemically speaking. I included some papers promoting pragmatic encroachment theory, as well as counter papers from Georgie Gardner, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, maybe it's someone else, but refuting that, as well as papers pro and con for the evidentialist standpoint. So yeah, I don't believe this. I agree with Mike Lacona's take, like extraordinary claims do not require extraordinary evidence. And even claims that have pragmatic costs, look, more than 50% is enough to believe it. Our aim is truth. We don't care about the practical costs at all. We just believe what is true. Now, do you commit? That's a separate question. Do you want to commit to those beliefs? And on that front, sure, yeah, there would be these practical costs, but I mean, where are the practical benefits, Caleb the Atheist? Eternal benefits, don't care about any of this stuff. Even if it turns out I'm wrong, I really don't care. The benefits far outweigh these trivial costs once I believe that it's true. So yeah, just separate that. Look, when it comes to is Christianity true? Or is Christianity the religion God wants me to follow? Evidentialism is the way to go. Practical stakes mean nothing in terms of what's true. Practical stakes may be relevant when you're considering the question, and okay, I believe Christianity is true. Now, do I want to be like a demon? And a demon has knowledge that Jesus is God and stuff, and yet they don't place their faith or trust in God, and they continue to sin willfully against him. Do you want to be like a demon, or do you want to be a normal human being the way God designed you to function and place your faith in Christ? Okay, now I've committed. Now I'm going to say I do. You've proven you're true. Now I'm going to commit. And again, there's a list of potential costs here, but there's no fairness. There's no, what about the benefits of believing in Christianity? And you have to assess those if you're going to talk about the question of committing.
With that, the skeptic may conclude to say that Jesus is probably still dead in that sense. So that concludes the devil's advocate portion of the presentation.
I just have to say, with that conclusion, Caleb Jackson has officially proven that, as David Russell likes to say, he's a heretic. I'm just joking, Caleb. I'm just joking. All right, finish off your video. I'll let you have the last word.
Now, with that, I will end that there. I don't mean this to discourage any Christians watching. I mean this only to be constructive criticism, to show you what I would consider to be the best arguments on the other side, and that we really should look at them. And soon I'll be putting up a video to give the other side, to give the Christian's case, and to give the best case. And so I'm not trying to make the apologists feel uncomfortable, nor am I trying to help the skeptic. I'm simply giving both sides of the argument. And I want people to look at this honestly and sincerely and try to put aside their biases, which is hard to do. We all have biases. I'm no exception to that. But I tried in this to be as objective as I could and to represent the other side as fairly as I could, and to show that I think one can be reasonable in denying the resurrection. But as I will argue in the next video, one can also be reasonable in affirming the resurrection and that. So with that, I thank you so much for watching this presentation. And until next time, we shall see the case for the resurrection of Jesus. Until then, salutations.
All right, awesome. So that's,
I'm no exception to that.
okay, so that's it. Yeah, that's it. Overall thoughts. So yeah, I've been a little bit tough and polemical and joking at times with Caleb here, but that said, in all sincerity, at this point, now that we're finished, I do want to say this was a great job. Thank you so much, Caleb, for taking the time to do this video. I really do agree with the devil's advocate approach. I think it is a good exercise to try and get into the other side's shoes, and I think it helps us iron and sharpen our case and that sort of thing. And I think you did a great job for an hour video. I mean, what more can you expect? I think it was great of you to look, this is what I, Caleb, the Christian, I think is the best case that atheists can make. I disagreed at some points. There were some of the points where I was kind of, this should not be a part of an atheist's best case, all things considered. But regardless of that evaluational difference between us, you did a great job. I mean, it was clear, it was well organized, given your methodology and that sort of thing. It raised substantive points a lot of times. There were some points I couldn't figure out, like, really? Why? Like, especially the last stuff. And I think that just may come from a confusion of how auxiliary hypotheses impact. And I'll say that on my end, look, I was harsh on Caleb at times, trying to say, look, he's not giving us the details, he's just giving bullet points and stuff. Of course, what do you expect in a 1-hour video? I know that Caleb, the Christian, he has the necessary background to be summarizing these points in this way. Likewise, on my end, even though my videos are long and rambling and stuff like that, there's a lot of background that I have to leave out. I just can't get into. I don't have the time to go back and read all the books and then study and then try to find that one point, and stuff like that. So there's stuff that I'm selecting out and just summarizing it as a counterpoint type thing and leaving it at that. And that's what you have to do in podcasting and stuff like that. But other than that, yeah, it was really substantive. It raised good points of areas that hopefully Christians will investigate further. Not only that, question the methodology as well. This was a main aim of my review, is I wanted to make sure we're questioning the methodology, because I'm not sure that all of the points, even some of the points that are raised by atheists against the resurrection for sure, even atheist scholars. But is that the proper methodology? Is it in fact relevant to the given hypothesis that we're wanting to evaluate? And so I really wanted to highlight differences in methodology and bring questions. Is the atheist, Caleb, the atheist methodology necessarily the right one? Is this the right way to assess the given hypothesis he wants to raise? And finally, in the end, the joke was on me, because I was totally wrong in understanding a lot of my criticisms were based on a false understanding of what Caleb the atheist's goal here was just to prove an atheist can have reasonable doubt. So the hypothesis, the claim is the Christians, and the atheist is just saying, but I can have reasonable doubt. It's not more than 95% proven. Again, my arbitrary probability values of what I define proven beyond reasonable doubt to be. But yeah, on that front, I definitely would agree. I don't know. I don't know if Caleb has proven that from this video. He probably has. I don't know. Because when I watched it this whole time, I didn't watch it in that light. But I will just say, Dale, as a Christian, I definitely believe that, yeah, an atheist can have reasonable doubt. There's more than 5% probability that the resurrection hypothesis is false to my mind. So therefore, yeah, an atheist can have reasonable doubt. Maybe I'm wrong. I think it's proven on a balance of probabilities, but I don't think it's proven beyond reasonable doubt. So I would wholeheartedly agree with Caleb the atheist on this front and say, yeah, an atheist can have reasonable doubt. So if that was your goal, I'm pretty sure I know for a fact you're right. I'm pretty sure that you've done enough to establish that case. So mission accomplished if that was the case. But of course, as Christian, that's not the question we should be answering. That's not relevant. That doesn't matter. If you're an atheist or a Christian, that methodology is wrong and a foolish methodology. Who cares about something being proven beyond reasonable doubt? You don't need that. You just need to prove that it's more probably true than false in order to believe it. You can assess the practical stakes, whether you want to commit to it after the fact. Sure, take into consideration those practical costs and don't forget those practical benefits. But when we're studying the evidence or the truth or falsity of the resurrection hypothesis, evidentialism is true. Forget pragmatic encroachment. Look at the evidence, decide purely on a balance of probabilities on that basis, and follow the evidence where it leads. That's what a reasonable person would do. If you're demanding proof beyond reasonable doubt before you'll believe something, then you're unreasonable. You do not have reasonable doubts. So say you're an atheist and you believe the evidence proves, let's say 70%, just for the sake of argument. I've liked that number. You're 70% convinced the resurrection hypothesis is true, but you're saying, yeah, but the practical costs are such that I need more. I need proof beyond reasonable doubt. Then you aren't reasonable. You are an irrational and an unreasonable person at that point. Practical stakes be danged, irrelevant to the truth or falsity of the hypothesis. Again, committing to the religion is a totally separate question. And on that question, the practical stakes are relevant, but it's not relevant to the truth or falsity of the resurrection hypothesis. So we need to get that clear. Atheists adopting the pragmatic encroachment theory, that's wrong epistemically to do. And I would say that, atheists tend to be hypocrites when they apply it. They apply it to the beliefs they don't want to believe, but not the beliefs. They apply strict evidentialism to the beliefs they want to believe on the balance of probabilities. So yeah, it's very problematic. I'll include the papers again. I posted them up on the Evil God Challenge thing, but I'll include a couple papers on pragmatic encroachment theory and evidentialism for you guys again. But yeah, that's it. Hopefully this isn't too long, but yeah, have a great day. And I hope this was helpful in some way. All right, bye-bye. So just a quick addendum here. I just wanted to go over, because I was confused by what Caleb did at the end about the explanatory power. So I kind of thought about it a little bit more. And my take, so I think what he's doing, obviously these auxiliary hypotheses about whether God made clothes for him or whether he was reflecting light normally and stuff like that, these are totally irrelevant to explanatory power and judging the truth or falsity of the main hypothesis, right? So I was just baffled as to why Caleb the atheist was raising this, because it's not relevant to the explanatory power or the main hypothesis at all. However, I do think it's relevant, these secondary hypotheses, under the criterion of illumination. So I think that's what Caleb's going for, right? And on that front, I would agree with him that the dream or vision hypothesis probably would pass the criterion of illumination. It would, shed light on these secondary aspects. If it was dreams, then yeah, you'd get contradictory answers and stuff like that. Whereas with the resurrection hypothesis, at least for some of them, it's neutral. The truth of the resurrection hypothesis proper doesn't shed light on, well, did Jesus reflect light normally, necessarily, unless you say bodily resurrection entails normal reflection of light. There's no supernatural light or stuff like that. Or the resurrection hypothesis doesn't entail directly, did God create clothes for him, or did he have to go out and find some? And stuff like that. Maybe he disappeared and then took some clothes off the rack from somewhere. Transported to maybe he went to Nazareth and got some clothes from his old house, from his mom's house or something like that, and put them on, and then reappeared. Who knows? But yeah, the resurrection hypothesis does not shed light directly on that secondary theory. We just don't know the answer or something, right? But so it doesn't pass the criterion of illumination. So in that sense, I guess I would agree with Caleb that the dream hypothesis is better, or sheds more illumination, perhaps. At best, it passes, whereas the resurrection hypothesis is neutral. The resurrection hypothesis doesn't fail the criterion of illumination. It doesn't fail. Caleb didn't prove to show that the resurrection hypothesis, the truth of that, can't shed light on these questions or be consistent with answers to these questions. I know he asserted that, but he gave no reason to think that was the case. So yeah, that bit makes more sense if it's not about explanatory power, which is about the main hypothesis, but about the criterion of illumination, which deals with auxiliary or secondary hypotheses and the way the truth of a main hypothesis relates to those answers to the secondary hypotheses. And just to give an example, so I gave the quantum physics example, right? So let's say your main hypothesis is something like, just to illustrate, is something like the laws of physics are mathematical descriptions of things composed of subatomic particles. Okay, great. That's the main hypothesis that we're trying to prove, and you can give things about the answer. You can challenge the explanatory power based on, oh, well, things, the things that are being mathematically described are not composed of subatomic particles. Okay, that would directly attack the main truth or falsity, and therefore the explanatory power of the main hypothesis. You could argue in that way. But what you couldn't do is you couldn't go, yeah, but the truth of that hypothesis doesn't tell us the answer to, well, how does quantum entanglement work? How does the secondary or auxiliary theory of, are subatomic particles, are they waves or particles, or how does the double slit experiment work, or something, stuff like that. Secondary theories like these don't need to be answered in order for to believe in the main hypothesis is true at all. Now, it would be great. It would be the criterion of illumination if positing, well, it's true that the laws of physics are mathematical descriptions of things composed of subatomic particles. If that somehow shed light on the answer to secondary theories like quantum entanglement, how does that work? No, obviously it doesn't, right? It doesn't tell us the answer to that. You just have to go, I don't know, just like as is the case with the resurrection. And Caleb Jackson might say, well, the dream vision hypothesis of the laws of nature is a better has higher explanatory power. No, it doesn't. The best he could say, well, maybe it has fulfills the criterion of illumination because we would expect contrary weird quantum entanglement phenomena and weird phenomena, spooky action, as Albert Einstein called it, if we were dreaming. That would be illuminated, right? So they wouldn't have an answer to any of these secondary theories about quantum entanglement and what it is. So therefore, the dream hypothesis illuminates that, whereas the causal dispositions or description theory, normative description theory of the laws of nature doesn't shed any light on these secondary theories. Who cares? That's meaningless. At best, the criterion of illumination is a bonus criterion. It doesn't have enough weight to lend credence to one hypothesis over another overall. At best, it might lend some credibility to the positivity. It can't be used to falsify a hypothesis, or is very rarely ever used in that degree, because no one can prove that having to explain provide the answer to the secondary theory is necessary in order for the hypothesis to be true. Same, that's with the quantum theory, the laws of nature hypothesis, same deal with the resurrection. Caleb the atheist never proved that having an answer to how Jesus got his clothes is necessary in order for the resurrection hypothesis to be deemed true based on the evidence and prior probability. It's not. It'd be nice if it would illuminate it, but doesn't have to in order to be true. So on that front, Caleb was just mistaken. It has nothing to do with explanatory power. It does have to do with the criterion of illumination, and he might be right in terms of his evaluation that the dream or vision hypothesis performs better on the criterion of illumination than the resurrection hypothesis, because that's just neutral. It doesn't give the answers to some of these things, whereas the dream hypothesis would be expected not to give the answers, so it fulfills all of them and therefore passes the criterion of illumination. But that's such an insignificant weight attached to the illumination criterion that the resurrection hypothesis passes on explanatory power, proper explanatory scope, plausibility, as well as simplicity or less ad hoc. That just overwhelms the dreams or vision hypothesis passing on the illumination criterion, and therefore you have to believe in the resurrection hypothesis, just like scientists do with the laws of nature and the belief of subatomic particles. Things are composed of subatomic particles. Nobody read about the laws of nature. Yeah, the hypothesis. All physical things are composed of subatomic particles. That doesn't explain to me how quantum entanglement works. Therefore, taking a realist, physicalist interpretation that literally all scientists in the world, for the most part, take, believing that, yeah, things are composed of subatomic particles. Physical things are composed of subatomic particles, to say, well, that lacks explanatory power because it can't explain how quantum entanglement works. No, that's not how you evaluate things. That's not what the explanatory power criterion is. I think Caleb's might be confusing that with the criterion of illumination, which does speak to how a hypothesis or the truth of a hypothesis can explain secondary or auxiliary or shed light on and illuminate answers in secondary fields outside of areas directly relevant to the truth or falsity of your main hypothesis. So I just wanted to add that note. With that, I'll shut up and have a great week. Next week, we will be having Dr. David Kemble Cook, the former biblical Unitarian turned skeptic and general theist. And we're going to be talking about his next issue. So we'll finish off the problem of evil a little bit, but we'll also get into the atonement. How does that work? How does forgiveness work? Forgiveness of sins and everything like that. So look out for that. David Russell will be joining me to help me out for that. And yeah, have a great week. Bye-bye.